most serious WWE beefs are typically settled inside Hell in a Cell or the Boneyard or something, but occasionally a matter is so important that it must play out not in front of thousands of screaming fans, but some stuffy old judge. WWE have fought plenty of different groups and business associates in front of the courts, from the feds to the Parents Television Council to the Panda People and beyond. It's not exactly strange that WWE would have to defend itself from time to time, given the nature of its business and the controversy it's usually more than happy to attract. What is noteworthy, however, is when one of WWE's former wrestlers instigates legal proceedings. It doesn't happen all too often, since WWE is the big game in town and most who wish to earn a living in the business don't want to burn that bridge, but it does happen, and for a variety of reasons. Most of it comes down to money, naturally, and while Jerry McDevitt and the boys have a decent track record in this arena, they do also take the occasional loss, which, as you will see, can be rather costly. I'm Adam Pacitti from Cultaholic Wrestling, and these are 10 wrestlers who sued WWE. Join us. Number 10, Ricky Steamboat. You knew what you were getting with Ricky Steamboat, one of the hardest working professional wrestlers in the biz across the 70s, 80s, and into the 90s. Hell, even when he made an inexplicable WWE comeback in 2009 at the not exactly sprightly age of 56, he still put in a hell of a shift and made sure his performance measured up to expectations. But just because he was the consummate pro between the ropes doesn't mean he didn't get caught up in backstage politics and business disputes. He left WWE in 1988 after he, as the new Intercontinental Champion, raised the ire of Vince McMahon by requesting time off after the birth of his son, Richie. The career babyface left under similar acrimony in 1991 when, as the fire-breathing dragon, he refused to do televised stretcher jobs for IRS and The Undertaker. Clearly a businessman not to be taken lightly, Steamboat eventually sued WWE over what he felt were royalties owed due to the success of WWE's VHS line in 1994. The suit dragged on for years and ended with a joint motion by both parties to dismiss, and there were clearly no lasting hard feelings since Ricky would come back to the company and work as a road agent and trainer. As an aside, Steamboat once threatened WCW and Ultimo Dragon with a lawsuit, as he had trademarked the name Dragon for use as a wrestler, despite the fact that he had been retired for years at that point. And this is one of the good guys. Number 9, Larry Zabisco. Larry Zabisco learned a lot from his hero, mentor, and famous rival Bruno Sammartino. Zabisco earned his reputation thanks to his battles with Sammartino, as the student took on the master in a series of lucrative matches around the United States. After his bumping days were done, Larry became a commentator for WCW and then did some things on the indie scene once the company had collapsed. He was pretty quiet until he heard Chris Jericho refer to himself as a living legend on WWE television in late 2001, sending the company a cease and desist since he claimed that he had a common law trademark on the term. Clearly, Zabisco learned how to battle WWE from Bruno too. When WWE not only refused to cease and desist, but Vince McMahon himself called Jericho by that nickname on television, Zabisco filed suit. Y2J was called and had to give a deposition in a room full of Zabisco's lawyers as he was quizzed about his usage of the name. It was all very silly and a waste of time really, especially when it came out that Larry didn't even have a proper trademark on it after all. Oops. A big old unnecessary distraction for everyone involved. The only thing this accomplished was halting the production of a planned Chris Jericho Living Legend t-shirt. Number 8, Raven. Don't let the fact that he took steel chairs to the head and willingly allowed himself to be thrown through tables or into barbed wire fool you. Scott Levy is a bright bloke and is often cited as one of the smartest men in the business. A low bar granted, but work with me here. It's no surprise then that Raven would take umbrage with what he perceived to be WWE's unfair business practices. The former ECW champion, who had spells with WWE as Johnny Polo in the 90s and as Raven in the early 2000s, has sued WWE on a couple of occasions over the years. The first lawsuit was a combined effort between himself, Chris Kanyon, and Mike Sanders, the former WCW star who worked for WWE's developmental territories, as the trio took WWE to task in 2008 over the old independent contractor designation. Long an issue with those who believe WWE performers need to unionize, the crux of the matter was that WWE classifies its talents as independent contractors, yet tells them exactly when, where, and how to work, and doesn't allow them to work elsewhere or give them benefits like healthcare. The case was ultimately dismissed, but Raven tried his luck again almost a decade later, this time teaming up with Marcus Buff Bagwell to sue for royalties they felt owed due to footage of them appearing on the WWE network. Ultimately, lawyers on both sides agreed to drop the litigation. Number 7. Charles Austin. Back in the bad old days of TV tapings filled with endless squash matches, WWE had a small army of enhancement talents they could rely on to make their stars look good. Or not, as it turned out, because a lot of these jobbers were not properly vetted, giving us stories like an underage Jeff Hardy being booked on Monday Night Raw, or countless tales of inexperienced grapplers who were so clueless that they didn't know how to sell or bump properly, and ended up making the people they were there to put over look pretty bad. In December of 1990, and with only 6 weeks of formal training and a handful of matches under his belt, Charles Chuck Austin teamed up with the far more experienced Lanny Poffo to take on the Rockers at a WWE Superstars recording. Towards the end of the match, disaster struck when Marty Jannetty performed his Rocker Dropper finishing move, with Austin taking it wrong, landing on his head and neck and suffering instant paralysis from the shoulders down. He subsequently sued WWE and Jannetty for negligence and was awarded a whopping $26.7 million in damages, then lowered to $10 million when WWE settled out of court upon appeal. The match itself, of course, never aired. Number 6. Sable. Sable's rise in WWE coincided with a rise in the trousers of a million men, as she used her sex appeal to win the hearts of the young and predominantly male Attitude Era audience. Whether strutting about in a barely there bikini, which we can't show on this video, or scrapping with Jacqueline or even husband Mark Merrow, Sable was box office, and people tuned in their droves in order to catch a glimpse of her, preferably wearing the skimpiest outfit possible. After a couple of years on top, Rena Merrow began to tire of life in WWE, and just a few weeks after dropping the Women's Championship and leaving the company at the height of her popularity, she made her grievances public by filing a $110 million lawsuit against her recent employer. Her suit claimed negligence, breach of contract, unfair trade practices, and intentional infliction of emotional distress. Among her many complaints were WWE trying to get her to expose her breasts in a live arena setting and asking her to participate in a lesbian-themed angle. While Merrow had posed for Playboy before, she balked at being asked to show her so-called puppies in front of a crowd, especially with children in attendance. In the end, the two sides came to a settlement agreement just a couple of months after the lawsuit was filed, the terms of which have been kept confidential. 4 years later, Sable returned to the company, where the creative staff finally got her to kiss a woman on screen. Great job, lads. Jesus Christ. Number 5. Brock Lesnar. Speaking of Sable, she didn't just come back and swap spit with Vince McMahon and Tori Wilson. She actually met and fell in love with future husband Brock Lesnar, the man who shockingly left WWE to pursue an NFL pipe dream less than a year after they met. The next big thing was burned out and tired of the road and the injuries, and handed in his notice to WWE just before WrestleMania 20. In order to receive his release, however, Brock foolishly signed a non-compete and agreed that he wouldn't perform for another wrestling or MMA company until mid-2010. When the pro football thing didn't work out and Lesnar assessed his options, he decided that he needed to go and earn a living and realized that wrestling was his best way of doing that, so he took WWE to court over the non-compete. When he began working for New Japan Pro Wrestling in 2005, WWE countersued in response. In the end though, the Beast Incarnate won in the courts and he and WWE eventually settled. WWE's worldwide non-compete was quite obviously a ridiculous thing to try to enforce, and it was patently unfair to Brock. They just didn't want anyone else to have him if they couldn't. Lesnar, banter merchant that he is, temporarily renamed his F5 finisher the Verdict while competing in the Far East, a reference to his legal triumph. Number 4. Superstar Billy Graham. Superstar Billy Graham was a big deal in his 1970s prime, but in the decades since has been a monumental headache for the organization that made him famous. The outlandish and outspoken Graham tried to kick the company while they were down in the mid-90s when he sued WWE as they were going through sex and drug scandals. Graham came out of the woodwork to file suit against WWE and its former Dr. George Zahorian, who was implicated in the federal government's steroid case against the company. Superstar had the gall to blame WWE and Zahorian for the long list of steroid abuse-related ailments that he was suffering from in retirement, and claimed that they had forced him to take the performance enhancers in order to keep his position on the card. His claim was quickly dismissed, since anyone with eyes could see that Graham had been on the gas for at least a decade prior to stepping foot inside a WWE ring. Superstar later claimed on an episode of WWE Confidential that his lawsuit had been motivated by bitterness and expressed remorse for his actions, writing Vince a letter where he apologized. And it clearly worked, as Graham was inducted into the WWE Hall of Fame in 2004. Number 3, Jesse Ventura. With his days in the ring behind him, Jesse the Body Ventura, another past favourite of McMahon's, settled into a new role as a colour commentator. And that was fine and all, but sitting in the broadcast booth obviously didn't pay quite as much as an MSG main event, and Ventura became irked at his decline in earnings. Turns out there was a reason he wasn't getting paid as much as he should have been. When negotiating his contract in 1987, the Body waived his future royalties from VHS cassette sales when he was incorrectly informed that only featured performers would receive them. Fast forward 4 years, and when Ventura learns that other non-featured performers received royalties, he's a little bit miffed to say the least. So he files a lawsuit claiming fraud and misappropriation of publicity rights, seeking $2 million in damages. Jesse would actually go on and beat WWE in 1995 after they had the case moved to a federal court. He was awarded over $800,000, but Vince declared that he would never work with him again and actually went back and edited out Ventura's commentary from certain broadcasts so as not to owe him royalties on those tapes. In the end, money talks, and Ventura did return to WWE in 1999 while serving as governor of Minnesota. He was inducted into the WWE Hall of Fame in 2004. Number 2, Nicole Bass. Nicole Bass was a product of the Attitude Era and was never realistically going to be in WWE for too long. Bass, a former champion bodybuilder, showed up at WrestleMania 15 as Sable's bodyguard and spent a couple of months in various storylines with Jeff Jarrett, Deborah, Val Venus, and Ivory before she abruptly left the company, claiming that she could make more money doing apartment wrestling. And if you don't know what apartment wrestling is, the internet is your friend, or in this case, your enemy. Just leave safe search on, okay? Truth is, as impressive as Bass was to look at, she had virtually no experience as a trained wrestler and simply wasn't any good in the ring. Also, with the similar looking Chyna on the roster, something had to give eventually, and WWE certainly didn't want to go down that route. After leaving WWE, Bass filed a $120 million lawsuit against WWE, citing sexual harassment. The heart of her suit was an alleged incident on a plane back from the UK, where she claimed Steve the Brooklyn Brawler Lombardi had groped her. The case eventually went to court in 2002, but was dismissed after WWE lawyers noted inconsistencies in her accounts of events, while witnesses such as Triple H and Vince McMahon himself added to the character assassination. She then took the case to the US Court of Appeals, where it was hastily thrown out. Number 1, The Ultimate Warrior. A lot can be said about the life and career of the Ultimate Warrior, but one thing is for sure. Jim Hellwig was in the wrestling business to treat it like a business. While the fame and glory were all side effects of his superstardom, Warrior could really take it or leave it at the end of the day. All of that stuff, while great, was an illusion. It was the money that was real. And so when it came time to protect himself and his earning power when he felt WWE were being unfair, he took them to court. After leaving WWE in a cloud in late '92, Hellwig legally changed his name to Warrior the following year in a bid to control his character. That factored into his 1996 WWE comeback and the legal action he engaged with following his inevitable dismissal just a few months later. He sued WWE for breach of contract and also for the rights to the name and gimmick, which he won in 2000. But the litigation didn't end there, as Warrior, legal name, sued WWE again in 2006 for defamation following the release of the Self-Destruction of the Ultimate Warrior DVD. The suit was dismissed a few years later. Ultimately, the two parties put all the bad blood behind them, and the Warrior was inducted into the WWE Hall of Fame in 2014, just days before his untimely passing.